Greetings, my fellow friends of the past. I hope you're well. We had to put some other projects on hold because, well, this one's just so important it kind of defines the channel. Just what is a castle?
Sir Reese, you ask, what is a castle? Well, good sir, it's obvious. This is a castle. This is a castle, and this is a castle.
Now hold on to your drawbridge, Steve, because according to the French at least, this is also a castle. And the Tudors called this a castle. But this isn't. It's a fort. Why? What's going on here? Well, both Porchester Castle behind me and Pevensey Castle in East Sussex are great examples to use for this video, because both of their outer walls are 3rd century Roman. A fort in today's terms is essentially a military building designed to be defended from attack, consisting of an area surrounded by a strong wall in which soldiers are based. Well, that is a bit clunky, but it does give us a useful definition for a fort. But for us to get to the definition for castle, a core part of figuring this out is going to be our language itself. Etymology, the origin of the word and how its use has changed. Back in my very first video on the topic of Roman Porchester, I mentioned the name itself has descended from the Saxon word for these Roman forts, Chester, variations of which can be found all over England, Chichester, Doncaster, Manchester, Cirencester, and of course, Porchester. The original Roman word was castrum, or castra when used plurally, but they also used another word, castellum, which is a diminutive, smaller form of castrum. It was used for smaller fortifications like watchtowers, which, at most, could contain a small detachment rather than a full army like a castrum. And it's from this word that Old French and the Normans derived castel. In modern French it evolved into chastel and eventually chateau, but in English it became castle. So if we followed the evolution of the word, it will just mean little fort.
But Reese, this is hardly what we call little.
Absolutely. Etymology only gets us so far. So we're going to need to go a little bit further, aren't we? Indeed, why do we define forts and castles as entirely different things today? Well, as I said earlier, a fort would house soldiers. They're designed as a safe encampment for an army. But in the medieval period, a castle would describe a fortified structure built to defend a particular household. Yes, some soldiers would be based within it, but that wasn't its main purpose. Looking at how the systems for administering their armies evolved between the Romans and the medieval period is going to help us quite a bit here. The Roman army under Augustus was a standing army, permanent, professional, volunteer soldiers serving a standardised 25-year term. The chain of command across the empire was also largely standardised. But it was very much not so in much of medieval Europe, France and England in particular. A medieval lord would manage a large patch of land, with a large population of labourers working to support him and his family, who would then in turn pay the tax to the king. When an army was needed, the forces would mostly consist of hired mercenary groups. Of course, those of particular power or wealth, such as we see with the many bishops of England and the higher-ranked nobles, would also have their own knights, but these would be, generally speaking, much fewer in number than the mercenaries. In battle, the knights and the lord himself would be a target for capture and ransom due to their wealth. So then, when not at war, as feudal rulers, these lords would need protection for themselves and their families. Their place of residence? Well, it often looks something like those old Roman watchtowers, the castellum, which brings me back to Porchester Castle. Down here on the south coast by what was once the main port, we have our old Roman fort, our castrum, from which we derived the name Porchester. And then within that, the Normans constructed a fortified residence, this tower. And now we have our little fort, our castellum, our castle.
So you're saying that this is the port's fort with a mini fort? You're just making this up now, dude.
No, that's what they did, Steve. They very much just borrowed a term that sort of looked like something that came before them. So when most people are talking about castles, this is what they're picturing. A fortified residence for a medieval lord. But the problem is this doesn't account for why these are also called castles. After the 1500s, things just get a bit messy, really. I mean, here's Hurst Castle. Ignoring the 2 wings that were added in the Victorian period, the central keep and the 3 surrounding bastions, were ordered by King Henry VIII. It was designed as an artillery fort, one of a series of device forts along the south coast, housing a professional garrison to defend against possible invasions from France. So it's not a castle. Definitionally speaking, it's a fort. But if we take that original 16th century structure, with its central tower surrounded by thick walls, it kind of looks like one. What about this? Chateau d'Arouet. Well, it incorporated 4 medieval towers into the 18th century house. So that means, well, it's close enough, right? We can go with that? Yeah. What about Leeds Castle then? Well, Leeds Castle has been demolished and significantly rebuilt several times to make it more comfortable for its residents. As such, little of the defensive capabilities remain. It's got a moat and, well, that's about it. What about New Wardle Castle?
Reese, that is not a castle.
Well, no. It's a manor house.
But you just said it's a castle.
But it is built near Old Wardle Castle, which was besieged and damaged in the English Civil War.
How is that a good enough justification? It's starting to look like, after the medieval period, the word castle could basically apply to whatever you like.
Yeah, pretty much. But if that is true, then I have basically wasted everyone's time with this video. I've spent 10 minutes to say that, well, at some point the word meant something, and then it became arbitrary. People in the past played quite fast and loose with terms, so trying to narrow down definitions today is quite a challenge.
Well, to be fair, mate, wasting people's time is indeed the job of philosophers. That's what's been said, at least. But do we at least have an answer? Do we know what a castle is?
Well, a structure typically built in the medieval period as a residence for someone of wealth and importance, such as a noble or royalty, featuring either functional or symbolic fortifications. So, does that work as our final definition? No, not really. I mean, we have no hard line for what types of fortification. Many were simply displays of power and not actually particularly defensive. There's no line for what level of wealth or titles you had to have. If I say residence, does it count if the noble or royalty only lives there once every few years? There's no specific dates either, and as I've shown with Hurst, the word hasn't even been used consistently throughout the centuries. Now, I've spent some time going through the development of the language and its role in medieval society. But, and it's a big but, this is a very Anglo-centric view on what a castle is. If we go to other countries and cultures, we will find that defining a castle becomes even harder. Steve and I have been to Malbork Castle in Poland, considered to be the largest castle in the world by land area, and it was built by the Order of Teutonic Knights to act as their headquarters and administrative centre, and once housed 3,000 knights. What makes it a castle? It's enormous, well beyond that original definition of castellum. So, what is a castle? Well, for the purpose of this channel at least, I'll stick with my definition. I'm exploring the UK, so it seems to make the most sense. But for elsewhere in the world? Well, I guess that's for those societies to define, isn't it?